The studio lights were bright that afternoon, the kind of brightness that made everything look perfect on camera but felt almost blinding to those sitting under it. The air buzzed with quiet excitement as the production crew made last-minute checks. Someone adjusted a microphone, another person whispered to the cameraman, and a makeup artist quickly dabbed a bit of powder on Sandra's forehead before retreating from the shot. It was a big day. The reunion interview everyone had been waiting for was finally happening. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock together again after years, sitting side by side. Fans had been talking about it for weeks, excited to see the two Hollywood stars who had once shared incredible on-screen chemistry reunite in front of the cameras. Keanu arrived first, calm as always. He wore his usual relaxed look, dark suit, simple shirt, his hair falling naturally to his shoulders. He greeted everyone with his quiet kindness, offering small smiles and gentle nods. He didn't make a scene or demand attention, but somehow, his presence filled the room anyway. When Sandra entered, laughter followed her. She always carried a certain light with her, a mix of warmth and charm that made people instantly comfortable. She greeted Keanu with a friendly hug, and their chemistry was immediately noticeable. It wasn't romantic in that moment, it was deeper, built from years of mutual respect and shared memories. The audience waiting behind the cameras clapped as the two sat down. The host, known for his high-energy personality, grinned as he introduced them. He was the kind of person who loved to keep things exciting, sometimes even pushing a bit too far to get a reaction, but everyone assumed he would keep it respectful today. It was, after all, a reunion meant to celebrate their friendship and the legacy of their work together. The opening minutes went smoothly. They talked about their first movie, the funny moments on set, and how strange it felt to be looking back after so many years. Keanu told a story about how Sandra once brought homemade cookies to the crew just to keep spirits high during a tough shooting day. Sandra laughed and teased him about his quiet nature, saying he barely spoke unless it was about something meaningful. The mood was light and nostalgic, filled with genuine laughter. The audience leaned forward, enjoying every second. It was exactly what everyone wanted to see. Two kind, talented people reminiscing about a time that meant so much to so many fans. Then, without warning, the tone began to shift. The host, perhaps feeling a bit too comfortable, started asking more personal questions. At first they were harmless, about fame, about how they handled the attention back then. Sandra handled them gracefully, her smile never faltering, but soon the questions became more teasing than curious. The host started making little jokes about their chemistry, implying there must have been more going on between them off camera. Sandra laughed politely, brushing it off. "We were just good friends," she said lightly. Keanu nodded with a small smile, confirming it, but the host wasn't ready to let it go. He leaned forward and said something that made Sandra pause. It wasn't vulgar, but it carried a tone that made everyone uncomfortable. He joked about her looks in a way that felt unnecessary, implying she had used her beauty to get ahead in Hollywood. For a moment, silence filled the room. Sandra's smile faltered ever so slightly. She tried to laugh it off, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The audience sensed it. A few people looked down, unsure of how to react. The cameraman's hands tightened on the rig. Keanu, sitting beside her, turned his head just a little. His expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Protectiveness, maybe, or quiet disapproval. He didn't speak right away, though. He let Sandra answer first, as he always respected her voice. Sandra, being the professional she was, handled it with grace. "I think everyone in this business has to work hard," she said calmly. "It's not about looks. It's about showing up every day and giving your best." She tried to steer the conversation back to their movie, but the host chuckled and interrupted her again. "Oh, come on," he said with a grin. "You can't tell me it didn't help. You two were the hottest pair on screen back then." It was meant to be funny, maybe even flattering, but it landed wrong. The laughter that followed sounded forced, nervous. Keanu could see Sandra shifting slightly in her chair, her hands clasped together. He didn't like it. Keanu had been in the industry long enough to know when a moment was starting to cross the line. He understood the difference between a joke and disrespect. His instinct was to protect, not in a dramatic or angry way, but with quiet strength. Still, he waited. He wanted to give Sandra the space to respond first if she chose to. Sandra smiled again, but this time it was tight. "I think people remember the movie because of the story," she said softly, "and because we both gave it our hearts." Her answer was honest and gentle, but the tension remained. The host, perhaps unaware of how uncomfortable it had become, laughed again and moved on to another question, still lingering too close to the same topic. Keanu glanced at Sandra. She looked composed, but he could see the subtle signs. Her eyes slightly averted, her shoulders a bit tense. He didn't say anything yet, but inside, he knew he wouldn't let this continue for long. As the interview went on, the crew noticed the difference in energy. What had started as cheerful and nostalgic now carried a quiet edge. People in the room exchanged looks, wondering if the host realized how far he was pushing. Keanu sat with calm patience, but his attention never drifted from Sandra. He listened to every word and every small change in her tone. He'd always admired her strength, how she could stay polite even when others might crumble. But this time, he could tell she shouldn't have to keep carrying the weight of someone else's bad joke. The camera zoomed in for a close-up, and even the audience watching at home would later notice it, the slight shift in Keanu's expression. His posture straightened, and the warm, relaxed look on his face turned serious. He didn't need to speak yet, but it was clear something had changed. Sandra tried once more to bring the conversation back to their work. "You know," she said with a laugh that tried to lighten the moment, "we were both just trying to make sure that bus didn't crash in every scene." The audience laughed, grateful for the humor. For a few moments, the tension lifted again, but then the host made another offhand remark, this one a little sharper, a little more careless. It wasn't cruel on purpose, but it was enough to cross an invisible line, one that made Sandra's eyes flicker down for a second, as if she wished she could be anywhere else. Keanu looked directly at the host then. The room went very still. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Just calm, unblinking focus. Everyone in the studio could feel it, the quiet power of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. He smiled slightly, almost politely, but there was firmness in his tone when he finally spoke. "I think Sandra deserves more credit for her talent than for anything else," he said softly. The host blinked, surprised. Keanu continued, his voice still gentle but steady. "She worked harder than anyone I've ever seen. She lifted the energy on set. Everyone looked up to her. There was a beat of silence before the audience began to applaud. It wasn't the thunderous kind of applause that came from excitement. It was slower, more meaningful. Sandra looked at him, eyes glistening with gratitude. She didn't have to say anything. Her smile said it all. The host laughed awkwardly, trying to move on, but the moment had changed everything. From that point on, the tone of the interview shifted back to what it was meant to be. Warm, respectful and full of shared memories. Behind the cameras, one of the crew members whispered, "He just saved that moment." Keanu didn't think of it as saving anything. To him, it was simple. He just couldn't sit there and watch someone he respected be made uncomfortable. As the interview wrapped up, Sandra thanked the audience and hugged Keanu again. The moment felt genuine, deeper now. It wasn't just two stars promoting nostalgia. It was two people showing what true friendship and respect look like under pressure. Later, when the episode aired, fans noticed everything: the awkward pause, Sandra's subtle discomfort, and the way Keanu quietly but powerfully turned the moment around. The clip began to spread, and people everywhere praised the way he handled it, with calm dignity, no drama, no anger. But for those who were in the room that day, they didn't just remember the viral clip. They remembered the feeling, the shift from awkward silence to a moment of real humanity. The kind that reminded everyone watching that kindness still has power, even in a world that often forgets it. And for Sandra, that day would always stand out, not because of the uncomfortable moment, but because of how it ended. The studio had gone quiet for a few seconds after Keanu spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was the kind that carried weight. People looked around, unsure whether to breathe or clap. The crew standing behind the cameras exchanged glances, and even the host, who was known for his loud personality, looked caught off guard. Keanu hadn't raised his voice or shown anger. He didn't need to. His tone was calm, but his words were clear and firm. It was as if he had drawn a line, not just for himself, but for Sandra too. Everyone felt the balance shift. Sandra sat beside him, her expression softening. The tension in her shoulders seemed to melt away. She turned toward him slightly, a faint, grateful smile forming on her face. For a brief moment, she didn't have to hide behind polite laughter. Keanu's few words had given her something simple but powerful: relief. The host tried to recover quickly. Of course, he said with a laugh that didn't quite sound natural. You both are legends, no doubt about that. Sandra nodded and smiled politely, helping ease the awkwardness in the room. We're just lucky people still care about the movie after all these years, she said. Her voice was calm again and she managed to bring warmth back into the air. Keanu gave a small nod of agreement. It's nice when something you make still means something to people, he added. His tone was so steady that it helped everyone settle again. The conversation slowly moved back to lighter memories. They talked about the movie's action scenes, how much work went into filming them, and the times when things went hilariously wrong. Sandra told a story about how a scene had to be redone because Keanu accidentally missed his mark while trying to keep her safe during a stunt. The audience laughed, and the laughter felt genuine this time. For a while, everything felt right again. But even though the host had moved on, something lingered under the surface. The crew could feel it. The earlier moment still hung in the air, not heavy anymore, but unforgettable. It had revealed something about both Sandra and Keanu that most people never got to see outside the big screen. After the cameras cut for a short break, the studio lights dimmed slightly. People started moving around again, producers checking their notes, assistants whispering directions, sound technicians fixing cables. Sandra leaned back in her chair and exhaled quietly. Keanu turned to her and asked softly, "You okay?" She smiled at him, her eyes showing both gratitude and fatigue. "Yeah," she said, nodding. "Thanks for that. You didn't have to step in, but I'm glad you did." Keanu shook his head. "You shouldn't have to deal with that kind of talk," he said gently. "You were being kind. That should have been enough." Sandra laughed lightly, not out of amusement but out of appreciation. "You always notice things, don't you?" she said. He smiled, a small quiet one. "Sometimes," he replied. Their exchange wasn't loud or emotional, it was subtle, but everyone nearby could sense the respect between them. It wasn't about protecting someone in a dramatic way. It was about understanding when another person was uncomfortable and choosing to do something about it without making it worse. When filming resumed, the atmosphere was different. The audience, both in the studio and later those who would watch online, could sense that shift too. There was something deeper between the laughter now, an unspoken trust, a quiet reminder of how people should treat one another. The second half of the interview turned into one of the most heartfelt conversations they'd ever had on camera. The host, perhaps realizing his earlier mistake, changed his approach completely. He began asking genuine questions about their experiences, their growth, and the lessons they had learned after decades in the industry. Sandra shared how, early in her career, she often doubted herself. "When you're young," she said, "you think everyone else knows what they're doing and you're just trying to catch up." Keanu nodded. "I still feel that way sometimes," he said honestly, making the audience laugh. "I just try to keep learning." The simplicity of his answer made everyone smile. That was part of what made Keanu so loved. He didn't act like someone above others. He spoke like a person who had been through things and still believed in being decent, no matter how big the stage got. Sandra leaned forward slightly, looking at him as he spoke. "That's why people respect you," she said. "You've stayed grounded." He gave a soft chuckle. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just like quiet places." The audience laughed again, but this time the mood was relaxed and genuine. The earlier tension had turned into something positive, a reminder of how easily one person's calm strength could turn an uncomfortable moment into something better. As the interview wrapped up, the host thanked them both and made sure to end on a respectful note. "You two are truly icons," he said, smiling. "Thank you for sharing your time with us." Sandra and Keanu smiled politely and the audience clapped warmly. The cameras faded out and the lights dimmed, but what happened after the cameras stopped rolling became just as meaningful as what was captured on screen. Sandra stood up and stretched her arms, letting out a small sigh. Keanu picked up a water bottle from the table and handed it to her without saying a word. She accepted it with a grateful nod. "That could have gone worse," she joked softly. Keanu smiled. "Could have gone better too," he said, his tone playful but understanding. She laughed quietly. You saved that moment, she admitted. You have a way of saying things without making a scene. I admire that. Keanu looked thoughtful for a second. Sometimes silence can be louder than shouting, he said simply. Sandra nodded slowly. You've always been like that, she said. You don't talk much, but when you do, people listen. There was a short pause. Neither of them needed to fill it. Some people bond through long conversations, others through quiet moments of mutual respect. This was one of those times. As they walked backstage together, crew members came up to thank them. One of the producers approached Keanu and said, "That was powerful what you did back there. You handled it perfectly." Keanu only smiled politely and said, "She didn't deserve to feel uncomfortable. That's all." It wasn't a speech or an attempt to make himself look good. It was just the truth. Later, as the two sat in the lounge area, waiting for their cars, they continued talking like old friends. The conversation drifted from their movie days to everyday things. Books, travel, small stories from life on the road. Sandra told him about a time she got lost in a small town while shooting a film and ended up helping a local family paint their porch. Keanu listened quietly, smiling, occasionally asking gentle questions that showed he was really listening. She paused and said, "You know, I think people don't always understand what it takes to stay kind in this business. It's easy to become hard after so many years." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I think kindness is a choice you have to keep making," he said, "even when people make it difficult." Sandra looked at him and said softly, "That's probably why people trust you. You don't react, you respond." He gave a small, almost shy laugh. "Maybe I just take longer to think," he said. They both laughed quietly, and for a moment it didn't feel like an interview had just ended. It felt like two people catching up after a long time, sharing space that felt safe and genuine. Outside the studio, fans had gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of them as they left. When the doors opened, cheers erupted. Keanu waved softly and Sandra smiled brightly at the crowd. They both stopped for a few photos, greeting fans warmly. There was no rush, no pretense, just two people who understood how much those small moments meant. Before they went their separate ways, Sandra turned to him. "You know, that clip's gonna go everywhere," she said with a laugh. "People will see what you did." Keanu shrugged lightly. "It's okay," he said. "If it reminds someone to treat people better, that's a good thing." Sandra smiled. "You really mean that, don't you?" He nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." She gave him one last hug before getting into her car. "Thank you again," she said softly. He smiled, that familiar calm expression still on his face. "Take care," he replied. As her car pulled away, Keanu stood there for a moment, looking out at the crowd still calling his name. Then he gave one more small wave and walked toward his own car, slipping away quietly, just as he always did. That night, the clip from the interview began circulating online. Fans noticed everything. The moment Sandra's smile faded, the tension in the room, and the way Keanu had stepped in without aggression or ego. People shared it with captions like, "This is how you stand up for someone with respect," and "Keanu proves again why he's loved by everyone." News outlets picked it up too, writing about how he turned an uncomfortable situation into a lesson on grace. Sandra later mentioned in another interview that what Keanu did wasn't about defending her. It was about reminding everyone how simple respect can change a moment. And she was right. Because sometimes, it isn't the loudest person who makes the biggest impact. Sometimes, it's the one who speaks softly but carries truth in every word. In the end, the moment that could have been remembered for the wrong reasons became something else entirely. A quiet story of kindness, respect, and friendship. And that's what made it stay in people's hearts long after the camera stopped rolling. The clip didn't take long to spread. Within hours, it was all over social media. Shared, retweeted, reposted, and commented on by thousands. Fans, critics, and even people who didn't follow the entertainment world had taken notice. The interview, which had started off like any other, had become something more. Something that went beyond just a celebrity reunion. The first few hours were a whirlwind. Clips from the interview began popping up everywhere. On Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. At first, people focused on the light-hearted parts, the funny stories, the banter between the two stars. But soon the tone of the clip shifted. As people started re-watching the interview, they began to zero in on the moment that had stood out. when Keanu had defended Sandra so quietly, so firmly. It was one small statement, but it carried so much weight. "She deserves more credit for her talent than for anything else," Keanu had said, his voice steady and calm. There was something about how he said it, without anger, without fanfare, that made people stop and think. It wasn't just a defense of Sandra. It was a quiet statement on respect, kindness, and the importance of standing up for others in a world that often rewarded loudness over integrity. Fans were quick to praise Keanu. They flooded social media with messages like, "Keanu's the kind of man we all need more of, and this is the real definition of being a good human." The clip was even shared by people outside the entertainment industry, public figures, activists, even teachers and parents who saw the moment as a teaching point. It wasn't about celebrity gossip. It was about how one person can make a difference by simply acting with decency. Sandra, who had been quietly watching the reactions online, was deeply moved. She hadn't expected this kind of outpouring. She had been grateful when Keanu had stepped in during the interview, but seeing the way people responded to it made her feel something deeper. It wasn't just about the defense of her. It was the reminder that, in a world that often seemed quick to criticize and tear down, there was still room for kindness. That evening, Sandra sat in her living room, scrolling through the endless comments on her phone. She saw messages from people who had followed her career for years, but also from people who had just witnessed that moment for the first time. Some of the messages were from women who thanked her for showing what it meant to stand up for yourself without losing your dignity. Others were from people who simply said, "Thank you for reminding us that kindness still exists." It was humbling. It was overwhelming. And for a moment, she wasn't just a famous actress. She was a person, someone who, like anyone else, needed moments of support, of respect, of kindness. And in that moment, it felt like the world was sending that energy back to her. Keanu, on the other hand, didn't immediately notice how fast the clip was going viral. He didn't check social media the way most people did. He had never been one to follow the latest trends or pay much attention to the noise of the online world. But when his phone began buzzing nonstop with messages, texts, and notifications, he realized something was happening. The first few messages were from close friends. "Dude, did you see the clip? That was epic. You nailed it. That's why we love you." But as the notifications piled up, he realized this wasn't just a small moment. It had turned into a movement in a way. People weren't just watching the clip. They were talking about it. They were sharing it. And they were thanking him for showing the world what it meant to protect someone with respect. Keanu wasn't one to bask in the spotlight. He never had been. In fact, he rarely even looked at the reactions to his actions. He was always more comfortable in the background, quietly going about his day without drawing attention to himself. But this felt different. Not because of the praise, it was more about what it meant. He thought about Sandra and how during the interview, she had tried to brush off the uncomfortable comments. How she had remained calm and graceful despite the situation. Keanu wasn't interested in accolades or compliments. What mattered to him was that he had done the right thing. That in a moment when someone was being subtly attacked, he had stepped in without making a spectacle of it. It was simply about standing up for what was right. A few days later, Sandra and Keanu were scheduled for another interview together, this time with a more serious tone. The interviewer was aware of the viral clip and asked both of them how they felt about the way things had unfolded. Sandra answered first. "It's been overwhelming," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't expect this kind of response. It wasn't about the defense. It was about something more, about people recognizing that kindness matters. That's all." She smiled slightly, looking at Keanu. "But I'm glad it happened the way it did. I didn't have to say anything. He just knew." Keanu nodded, his expression calm but thoughtful. "It wasn't about defending her," he said quietly. "It was about showing respect. That's what people forget sometimes. You don't have to shout to make a point. You don't have to be loud to make a difference. A few simple words, said with the right intention, can change everything." The interviewer leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "It's interesting," he said. "Because what you did wasn't just about your relationship with Sandra. It was about how we all can choose to respond when things go wrong, when someone is uncomfortable or hurt." He paused, adding, "That's the real power of your reaction. You didn't let it slide. You spoke up and people noticed. Keanu smiled lightly. I didn't think about it in those terms. I just didn't want Sandra to feel like she had to handle it alone. She didn't deserve that. The conversation turned to how both of them had seen the response online. Sandra chuckled. I've been getting messages from people I've never met, thanking me for what happened. It's kind of funny, but it's also really touching. I think people forget that we're all human, no matter what our jobs are. Keanu agreed. The thing is, we're all just people. We all have our moments of vulnerability. We all have times when we need someone to stand up for us. And if we can help each other, why wouldn't we? The interview wrapped up on a warm note with both of them sharing laughter and memories from their past work. But the undercurrent of that conversation, the deeper meaning of what had happened during that one interview, stayed with everyone. As the days passed, the response to the clip only grew. It was now a talking point in articles, blogs, and even podcasts. The message was clear. Kindness, respect, and quiet strength are still important in a world that sometimes seems obsessed with drama and noise. People were sharing the clip with their friends and family, sending it to coworkers and colleagues, and commenting on how it had changed their perspective. Even the host, who had been caught off guard by the whole situation, began to speak about it in a more reflective way. He publicly apologized for crossing the line during the interview and acknowledged how important it was to respect people, no matter who they were or what their position was in the industry. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was a step in the right direction, and the public response to his words showed that people appreciated that effort. Sandra and Keanu's relationship, already built on mutual respect, was now recognized by millions. Fans had seen the way they worked together, the unspoken bond that had been formed through years of collaboration and friendship, and they respected that bond even more, knowing that when things got difficult, they had each other's backs no matter what. For Keanu, the whole experience was a reminder of something simple. Kindness always matters. It didn't require applause. It didn't need recognition. It was just about doing what was right. And sometimes in the world of bright lights and fame, that's the hardest thing to remember. But he had proven that day in that quiet moment that even in the spotlight you could still choose to be humble, to be kind, and to be human. For Sandra, the response was a revelation. She had always known that Keanu was a special person, but seeing how people responded to his actions reminded her of the power of genuine respect. It wasn't about how much money or fame you had. It was about how you treated others in small moments and big ones alike. And in that moment she had felt truly seen, not as an actress, but as a person. The clip and everything that followed was a reminder to people everywhere. It's easy to get lost in the noise, but it's moments of kindness and respect that leave a lasting impression. And as the story spread, it wasn't just about Keanu and Sandra anymore. It was about everyone who took the time to listen, to understand, and to treat each other with the care and dignity we all deserve. In the days following the interview and the viral clip, both Keanu and Sandra found themselves reflecting on what had happened, not just because of the attention, but because of the message that had emerged so unexpectedly. What started as an ordinary media appearance had sparked something much bigger, something that neither of them could have predicted. Keanu, who had always been the type to avoid unnecessary spotlight, found himself in a strange position. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of appreciation and praise. He wasn't used to it, and he didn't quite know how to process it. For Keanu, it had always been about doing the right thing quietly, without seeking recognition. But now it seemed as though the world was applauding him for his actions. At first it made him feel a little uncomfortable. He didn't need praise, he didn't need accolades. He had simply done what he thought was right in the moment. But as the days went by, Keanu started to see the bigger picture. People were not only applauding him for standing up for Sandra, they were appreciating the message it sent about how we all should treat one another. The clip had become a symbol of decency and respect, and that wasn't something he had expected. It was humbling. Sandra, on the other hand, spent most of her time reflecting on the unexpected wave of support. She had always known that kindness could go a long way, but the response from the public was something else entirely. She had spent much of her career in the public eye, learning to navigate the complexities of fame. But this felt different. The outpouring of love wasn't just about her being a star. It was about the moment when someone had stood up for her and how that moment resonated with people on a deeper level. She realized how much that simple gesture had meant, not just to her, but to others who felt overlooked, disrespected, or dismissed. Sandra's social media inbox was flooded with messages from fans and even strangers, people who had been moved by what had happened. Messages of gratitude, personal stories, and notes of encouragement flooded in. Some people thanked her for reminding them that they deserved respect. Others said that seeing how Keanu had spoken up had given them the courage to stand up for themselves in their own lives. It was overwhelming, and yet in many ways it felt like the world had offered her a kind of validation that she hadn't expected. People didn't just respect her for her career, but for who she was as a person. It wasn't about her image, her looks, or her popularity. It was about her dignity, her strength, and the way she had handled the situation with grace. In one of her quiet moments at home, Sandra found herself scrolling through the messages, reading them with a growing sense of gratitude. It wasn't just about the praise for Keanu's actions. It was the realization that people saw her for who she truly was. She had often felt that fame, while rewarding, could make it difficult to connect with others on a human level, but now it felt like the world had seen her in a way that she hadn't expected. Keanu, meanwhile, continued to live his life in the same quiet way he always had. He didn't read every article written about the viral moment. He didn't watch the endless reactions on social media. But when his friends and family brought up the situation, he would shrug it off with a humble smile. It was nothing, he would say in his typical understated way, but deep down he understood the ripple effect it had caused. It wasn't just about him or Sandra. It was about a collective recognition of kindness, respect, and how those things had the power to change the way people interacted with one another. Both Sandra and Keanu had long been aware of the importance of kindness in their personal lives. But the way this moment had played out reminded them of something essential, that the simplest actions often spoke louder than words. Keanu had demonstrated that standing up for someone didn't always have to be a big gesture. Sometimes it could be as simple as a quiet statement that shifted the tone of an entire room. A few days after the interview, the two of them found themselves having coffee together in a small cafe in the city, away from the prying eyes of the media. They were discussing the whirlwind of attention that had come their way. Sandra was still processing it all. "I've never had something like this happen before," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I mean, I've been in the industry for years, but this feels different. People aren't just talking about the movie. They're talking about the way we treated each other." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think it's because deep down we all want to be treated with respect," he said. "It's something people don't talk about enough, but everyone feels it." Sandra smiled faintly. "I've always known that," she said. "But sometimes in this industry it feels like respect is something people forget about. It gets overshadowed by fame, success, and all the noise. But this has been a reminder that at the end of the day we're all just people." Keanu took a sip of his coffee. "And we should treat each other that way every time." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. It was a rare moment of peace for both of them. Despite the chaos surrounding them, they had found a small corner of the world where they could just be themselves. Two people who understood the importance of kindness and the quiet power it held. As the days passed, the reactions to the viral clip continued to pour in. News outlets around the world covered it. Celebrities shared their own thoughts on what Keanu had done. Some wrote articles praising his actions, while others discussed how moments of kindness in the spotlight could inspire others to do the same. People in all walks of life began sharing their own stories of times they had chosen kindness over conflict or drama. Inspired by what they had witnessed in the interview, Keanu, who had never been one for attention, began to realize that this wasn't about him. It wasn't about building his image or promoting his work. It was about showing the world that the way we treat each other can have a lasting impact, even in the smallest moments. Sandra felt similarly. While she had spent much of her career trying to navigate the complexities of fame, this experience had shown her the power of authenticity. She didn't need to be a perfect celebrity or a flawless public figure. She didn't need to constantly prove her worth. What mattered was how she treated others and how she stood up for herself and those around her. That lesson stayed with both of them in the days that followed. They didn't allow the attention to change them, but it did shift their perspectives in a subtle way. It reminded them that even in an industry as fast-paced and competitive as theirs, it was still possible to stay grounded, to still be human. As the weeks went by, both Sandra and Keanu found themselves reflecting on the way people interacted with them after the viral moment. Fans seemed more open, more genuine, as if the interview had reminded them that celebrities were, in the end, just people. There was less of the usual adoration from a distance, and more meaningful interactions, whether it was a fan telling Keanu how much they admired his quiet strength, or someone thanking Sandra for reminding them of the importance of kindness. It was these small, everyday conversations that left the greatest impact on them. Sandra received handwritten letters, each one telling her how her actions had helped someone in a difficult situation. Keanu, while not as vocal about it, began receiving more personal messages as well. He was no longer just the action hero on screen. He had become someone people could relate to, a symbol of humility and grace. The two stars continued their work, of course, but the way they approached their interactions with others changed subtly. They were more present, more aware of how their actions and words affected the people around them. They had learned, in a way, that fame wasn't everything. What mattered most was the way you treated others, the way you helped those in need, and the way you stood up for what was right, even when the cameras weren't rolling. One afternoon, a few weeks after the interview, Sandra and Keanu were invited to speak at a charity event for children. It wasn't a grand event, but it felt important. As they stood together on stage addressing the crowd, it felt like everything had come full circle. The audience was filled with people who admired their work, but there was something more profound in the room that day. There was a shared understanding that kindness and respect were powerful forces, and that even small moments could create waves of change. The night ended with applause, but Keanu and Sandra didn't leave immediately. They stayed behind talking to the guests, shaking hands and hearing their stories. For both of them, it wasn't just another event. It was a reminder of the deeper connections that could be made when people were treated with dignity and care. As they left the event together, Sandra turned to Keanu and said, "You know, I think we've really made a difference." Keanu smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't think it's us," he said. "I think it's the people who are listening. They're the ones who are making the change." Sandra nodded, her heart full. "Maybe," she said softly, "but it starts with a choice. A simple choice to be kind." As the weeks went by, the impact of the viral interview and the ensuing reactions began to settle, but the underlying message remained strong. Keanu and Sandra had both returned to their routines, their projects, and their commitments, but something about the way they approached life had shifted, slightly, but noticeably. They continued to be themselves, but with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that small acts of kindness could spark something much bigger than they had anticipated. Keanu, for one, was quietly reflecting on the experience. While he was far from being someone who craved the limelight, he couldn't deny the ripple effect that had occurred after that moment of standing up for Sandra. People from all over the world had sent him messages, telling him how his words had inspired them. In the beginning, he hadn't quite known how to respond to the overwhelming amount of praise. He wasn't used to receiving such attention for something that felt so simple to him, but after a while he realized it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the message it conveyed, the message of respect, of standing by someone when they needed it the most, of choosing integrity over silence. Sandra, too, had found herself reflecting on the entire experience. It had been a humbling few weeks. She had spent so much of her life in the public eye, and while she was no stranger to the good and bad that came with fame, this time felt different. The overwhelming response from fans, strangers, and even fellow celebrities had touched her deeply. They hadn't just praised her career, they had recognized her humanity. And that meant more to her than any award or accolade ever could. In the weeks following the interview, Sandra had received messages from people all over the world, many of whom had shared their own stories of feeling overlooked or disrespected. They thanked her for showing them that they too deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter what their circumstances were. She'd always believed in the power of kindness, but seeing it reflected in the stories of others gave her a deeper understanding of how much small gestures could matter. One day, while walking through a park near her home, Sandra bumped into a fan who recognized her immediately. The fan was a woman in her mid-30s, wearing a simple dress and carrying a backpack. She seemed nervous at first, unsure of how to approach Sandra, but then she smiled and stepped forward. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Your interview, the one with Keanu, it really helped me. Sandra was caught off guard. She had received so many messages in the past few weeks, but this one felt different. The woman wasn't just expressing admiration for her career. She was expressing gratitude for something more personal. Thank you for saying that, Sandra replied, her voice gentle. But what do you mean? I'm glad it meant something to you. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I was in a really tough spot. At work, people were treating me badly, undermining me, disrespecting me. I didn't know how to stand up for myself without making things worse. Then I saw that interview, and when Keanu defended you, I realized something. It wasn't about fighting back. It was about standing my ground with respect. I've started doing that at work, and it's made all the difference. Sandra smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. I'm so glad to hear that. It's not always easy to stand up for yourself, especially when it feels like the whole world is against you. But you don't have to fight dirty to win. Just stay true to who you are. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you. You've really inspired me. As they parted ways, Sandra felt a deep sense of connection to this stranger. The words Keanu had spoken on her behalf had resonated far beyond that one moment. The impact of standing up with quiet dignity had rippled through the lives of people who had felt voiceless, unnoticed, or disrespected. In that brief exchange, Sandra realized just how far the message had traveled, and how deeply it had touched people's lives. Meanwhile, Keanu had his own encounters with fans, although he preferred to keep things low-key. He didn't seek out attention, but every now and then, a fan would approach him in public, thanking him for the way he had stood by Sandra during the interview. While he was grateful for the praise, he always downplayed his involvement, explaining that it was simply the right thing to do. One afternoon, while walking through a local market, Keanu was stopped by an older man who had recognized him. The man was in his 60s, wearing a baseball cap and a worn-out jacket. He smiled warmly at Keanu. Excuse me, the man said, his voice full of respect. I don't usually approach celebrities, but I just wanted to say that what you did for Sandra, it was powerful. It wasn't just about what you said, it was about how you said it. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't try to make a scene. You just spoke the truth, and that made a difference. Keanu was quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being singled out for something he saw as a small, everyday act. But there was something in the man's words that struck a chord. You're right, Keanu finally said. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be spoken honestly. The man nodded, his face thoughtful. That's the way to do it. In a world where so much is about ego and noise, that kind of honesty is rare. It's something we could all use more of. Keanu smiled, grateful for the unexpected connection. He had always believed that small acts of kindness, like standing up for someone when it mattered, could make a difference. But hearing this man's words, hearing how it had impacted him personally, made him realize just how far-reaching such simple acts could be. As the months passed, both Keanu and Sandra continued with their work, but the viral clip remained a part of their legacy. It wasn't just a moment in their careers, it had become a symbol of something much larger. People had taken the message of kindness and respect to heart, and it had sparked conversations in communities, schools, workplaces, and even within families. Sandra's social media following grew not because of her fame, but because of the way she had handled herself during the interview. She had become a symbol of grace under pressure, someone who had shown that it was possible to stand firm without compromising your values. Keanu, too, had seen a shift in the way people approached him. While he had always been respected for his roles in films, this moment had changed the way people viewed him. They didn't just see the actor, they saw the person, the man who believed in doing the right thing even when it wasn't the easiest choice. As the year drew to a close, both Keanu and Sandra received invitations to speak at various events and conferences, where they would share their experiences. They were often asked about the interview and how it had impacted them personally. While both of them were still somewhat reluctant to discuss the viral moment in too much detail, they understood that their story had become a powerful example of what could happen when people treated each other with respect. At one of these events, a young woman asked Sandra a question that caught her off guard. "Do you think that moment with Keanu changed you?" the woman asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Sandra thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "It did change me, not because of the attention or the praise, but because it reminded me that standing up for someone isn't just about defending them, It's about showing the world that we all deserve respect, no matter who we are or where we come from, and that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Keanu, who had been listening quietly, added, "I don't think it's about being a hero. It's about being human. We all have the power to make a difference, even in small ways. We just have to choose to do it." The audience sat in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in. It wasn't just a speech. It was a truth that resonated deeply. Keanu and Sandra had both learned something important in the months since the interview. They had learned that kindness and respect were not just things to be talked about. They were things that needed to be lived out every single day. As they left the event that evening, Keanu and Sandra exchanged a knowing glance. They didn't need to say much. They both understood that this journey was about something more than just one moment, one interview, or one act of kindness. It was about building a world where respect, empathy, and care for one another were the norm, not the exception, and with that they continued forward, each day more aware of the power of kindness and the quiet strength of standing up for what's right. In the end, it wasn't about what the world saw. It was about what they chose to do when no one was watching.